All right, we
All
are
right.
back. Week number 3. This is Album Impact with Joshua Ray Gooch. Happy to have an actual title for the podcast now. Waiting on that graphic design to be finished.
That sounds good, man.
It's going to be very fun. So this week we have one of my favorite people in the world, Mr. Jon Sosin.
Oh, hey there.
Jon Sosin is an amazing guitar player. He does a whole bunch of other stuff too, and produces and plays keys and does a bunch of stuff. But we originally met as a guitar player to guitar player, and you made fun of my tucked-in shirt, saying I looked like Seinfeld from the 90s.
But you did, though, didn't you?
I did. It's pretty accurate.
Pretty accurate. Good.
I think this shirt is much more Kramer, if I'm being honest.
Yeah, do you mind busting in real quick so I could really get a good... Yeah, no,
this is my Kramer shirt, but I've also expanded my aesthetic vision since I met you. I think we met back in like 2012 or 11, maybe, like when I first moved to town.
You were 19, and I remember because the gig we met at was at a bar.
Oh, you're right.
We're all worried about whether or not you could get in.
Oh man, I mean that was years of my life. Like there was a lot of years like that. But I just want to give a little bit of background on Jon. Jon, as far as a touring guitar player, this last several years has toured with an artist named Lukas Graham, who's known in the States, but is especially known in Europe and very, very, very big over in Scandinavia. Jon works a lot with James Iha of the Smashing Pumpkins, sort of as like, he sort of brings you in to do a bunch of stuff, right? You play all sorts of instruments and program and do keys and bass and guitar and everything, right?
Yeah, I mean, it started, I met James through this bass player named Matt McJunkins who plays in A Perfect Circle.
Great guy.
Yeah, great guy, quality guy. And he called me in to play keys on, I think it was a film pitch that he was doing. And I came in at the first couple of sessions, all I did was play keys. And then he asked me, like, do you think you could, do you play any guitar? You think you could play guitar in this? And that was my moment to be like, do I ever?
Wow. That's funny because Corey Churko, who is the sort of pilot episode of this podcast, he had a similar thing with when he got the Shania gig. They hired him as a fiddle player.
Right.
And they had no idea he played guitar until they were like, hey, we need somebody to play this guitar part. And he's like, I could do it. It's so strange how that happens. And you play on a lot of sessions as well. Like maybe sort of fill us in on some of the records you participated on, some of the stuff you're especially proud of, and all that kind of good stuff.
So in my early mid-20s, I met this other bass player in town named John Spiker who plays with Tenacious D, who does a lot of producing and mixing and all that kind of stuff. And he hooked me up with his buddy, Nolan Sipe, who's a writer and a producer. And Nolan started using me on a bunch of his demos. We did like a Cody Simpson record together. It's like a pop singer and a few other people. And then he hooked me up with this other producer named Jonas Jayberg, who is a Scandinavian producer, German Scandi, European.
Germa-Scandi.
A Germa-Scandi producer. And through that circle, I got hooked up with this producer named Jon Levine, who I did the Rachel Platten record, which did quite well. And we did some work with like, what else did we do? Andy Grammer. We did a bunch of Alessia Cara music.
He's a great guy. I worked with him, but only because Jon Sosin happened to be on the other side of the world.
Yeah. Thanks a lot for filling these shoes. Size 6s that you're filling. And as you should be. But yeah, so I kind of got looped into this whole pop session world very oddly. But
it makes sense. I mean, based on like what you do, like, when I met you, you were very much still sort of coming out of the college world, right? Like you were sort of in like rehab from all the jazz knowledge.
Yeah, jazz rehab.
Rehab. But it was great because I could tell that you were interested in some of the records like what we're going to talk about today, more sort of artsy-fartsy records, but you also had the theory knowledge and jazz knowledge to really get through in-depth changes and real jazz music or sort of Steely Dan-esque pop, sort of dense pop music. So it makes sense that you would get involved in those records. It sort of adds up with the stuff that you've internalized over the years.
Well, I was always told, and even like in working on jazz in college and really I think beforehand as well, I can't really pinpoint when and where this really sunk in. But having good tone and good time and good feel was like really the most important thing. And I was never like had the chops to like be like a shredder or anything. I just, it just like never came along. And I tried really hard. I bought all the books and all the shit I needed and I could never get it happening. So, but somewhere along the way, I developed good enough tempo with a click and a knowledge of how to get good tones enough to get called for records.
And
And
realistically, that's all those producers want. Like they could give two shits if you can play a bunch of like cacophony solos from, you know, like a Shrapnel Records
the last time,
album, you know.
the last decade that you needed to be able to like really play solos was the 80s. It's almost 40 years ago. It is 40 years ago.
Yeah.
So I mean, I grew up in the 90s. So that was, at that time, it was still like, okay, well, if you play guitar and you can't play like a ridiculous shredding solo, you're nothing. And being
Sure.
young, I mean, that's all you, I grew up like watching Joe Satriani VHSs and all that crap. So
Well, I think your problem might have been that you didn't own the Paul Gilbert one where he's green screened at like a beach the whole
I
time.
got it from the library. Yeah, no, I saw
You
that
had that one?
Frank Mbale one where he has the models in the back with the blow up guitars.
Yes.
Oh,
Dude,
no.
those REH videos were, I mean, we're both talking about it like we were like alive and functional. We were like getting this stuff. I started getting those like on YouTube, like early YouTube before they took everything down for copyright. Like remember back in like 2005, 6, 7, it was like you could see like dark web shit on YouTube and it was like
Yeah, it didn't matter. It was, I remember just thinking like, man, I remember growing up and my parents didn't want me to see a rated R movie, and now you could just go on YouTube for free and see the most heinous shit in the world,
yeah.
including Frank Mbale's instructional.
I mean, the amount of sweet picking in that video could be described as heinous.
I would say
Some would describe it as that. Okay, so now
what I came from. I came from watching all these shredder dudes and Metallica records and Pantera records and all that kind of stuff, and I could just never get the speed together. And then I went through my jazz phase of whatever, how many lost years that is. And to be clear, I do still value all that information, and I'm glad I did it for the time. However, you know, I mean, we'll talk about jazz later. But anyway, my point being, I started to drift more towards kind of developing those parts of my playing, and I was getting a lot of positive feedback. People were telling me, man, you sound really good, and it's like very easy to track you, and you have good parts ideas, and I was like, all right, well, great. Well, I can't seem to land a really prominent touring thing because of whatever reasons, and every other guitar player in line for audition looked like they just walked out of a J. Crew catalog or whatever. My frumpy ass ain't gonna get any of these gigs. So
they got those low rise jeans with the pubes popping out of the top.
God, I could never pull that off. But
I think you could. I think you've got a real look for it.
Now, I mean, things have changed. But yeah, so I just started getting all these calls to do records, and I never quite broke into the like TV. I'm not a great reader, so like all of the things that came up there were like, "Can you come in and read this?" I could try, but like that never really caught on. And then there's people like Andrew Sinowick and Tim Pierce and like all those guys kind of like have those kinds of gigs like on lock. Our mutual friend Adam Tressler is a monster reader. That guy gets a lot of those kinds of calls.
That's a very small world. I mean, there's a fair amount of work, not compared to what there used to be, but it's a small world. Like you could literally name probably 10 guitar players and be like, that's 90% of the movies and stuff that's going on.
And all those dudes, they read their balls off. So it's like, I mean, that makes sense. Like if I wanted to get into that world, like not only would I have to kill all those people, but I would have to learn how to read, which is way harder than murder.
Which
anyway,
you've meticulously planned out in several notebooks that are off camera.
How to learn how to read?
No, how to murder.
Oh, how to murder
guitar players.
The guitar players that read.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm publish it with Hal Leonard next year.
Well, hey, I did a book for them, so I got a real link up. I think they'd be very interested.
Yeah. So I ended up making a lot of records, and then through some mutual friends that are all in the touring circuit, I wound up playing with Lukas, and Lukas did up until all this Rona's crap going on now, a lot of traveling work. So the last like year and a half or so was mostly spent doing promo and gigs in Europe and Asia mostly,
Perfect.
which is great.
And this sort of leads us up to your two records that you chose today, because I think that the two records that you chose sort of perfectly exemplify all the different aspects that you've mentioned as far as like what people value about your playing and what people call you for are really all perfectly encapsulated in these two albums, which we shall wait no longer. The two records that Jon chose are Radiohead in Rainbows, which he clearly prepared for if you're watching this on video.
I'm so ready.
And the second record he chose is Beck Sea Change.
Correct.
And I love that you chose these records. It's very different than the last couple podcasts where it was records I was familiar with but wouldn't put on my like Mount Rushmore. Both of these records are extremely important to me as well. So I think there's a ton to talk about there. And we're going to sort of get into a bit of that story that you talked about before and how that trajectory led you to all those sort of gigs that you were talking about through these records. We talked a little bit before we got on here. We're going to start with the Radiohead record.
Great.
So this record came out in 2007, and like almost every Radiohead record except their first record, Pablo Honey, this was produced by Nigel Godrich.
Correct.
Which is going to be very important today because Beck Sea Change was also produced by Nigel.
Produced by Nigel Godrich. Isn't that insane?
It's insane, and I think it really is a testament to him. And he's going to be a big part of the conversation because I think it's pretty clear that his impact on these records is significant, very significant. And I think if you talk to Beck, any of the session musicians on the Beck recordings, or anybody in Radiohead, they'd be like, he's basically another member of the band. Like, he is absolutely essential to these recordings.
I would guess so. I mean, I read a little bit up on these records before this, and one of the things that I saw was that they were using another. This is specific to In Rainbows. Radiohead was using another producer for a minute, and they were really trying to kind of get some of the material off the ground, and they decided to scrap it all, and that the dude wasn't the right fit. And after like trying to go through some like self-production kind of phases of it and seeing what's going on, it was like not really getting good results. They brought Nigel in to work on it, which coincidentally he was busy probably working on the Beck record.
Yep.
I mean, so they're years apart, but apparently Nigel.
I think he was working on the Information at this point because that Information came out in 2006.
Okay. So everyone's trying to snatch this dude up because he's the guy with the sound and everyone wants something. And so far as I know, I don't know that much about Nigel Godrich other than everything that he touches sounds pretty fucking good.
Well, this is the interesting thing because I did a bunch of research for these, and it took me a bit of work. It took me more work than, let's say, like doing the podcast with Corey about A Night at the Opera for Queen. Like, there's a ton of information. They did a classic albums on VH1, and like everybody that's alive pretty much is still involved. Nigel is extremely secretive about his ways of working. So it took some like diving. I ended up finding a Tumblr devoted to Nigel Godrich that somebody had sort of taken every little bit of any interview with his engineer or, Justin Meldal Johnson, the bass player on Beck Sea Change, and tried to compile some sort of a website or at least a blog to figure out what exactly Nigel does and how he's doing this. And one of the interesting things that I found was that he could kind of give two shits about gear. Now, he obviously uses great gear, but he was like, I think the quote, I actually have it here because I thought it was a fascinating quote I almost was a little bit surprised, but I do think ultimately it makes sense when you listen to his records. The quote was, I'm strong technically, but I'm not interested in gear. I don't find equipment sexy. People are always asking me about microphones, especially people who make music solely on computers, but it has nothing to do with my business. So it's like
spoken like someone who gives absolutely no shits about what other people think of what he's doing.
Completely. And in doing research on a lot of the guys in Radiohead, the only guy who seems to really open up a lot is Ed O'Brien, the guitar player. And he sort of said the same thing about Radiohead, where he was like, we literally are not gearheads. Like the reason we use Vox amps is because like Johnny Marr played them. Okay, then we want that. Or like
But
it's
I think everybody, if we're going to talk about gear for a second, because I think gear is kind of important when it comes to making, even though Nigel Godrich thinks gear not important, like as far as that quote goes, which obviously he does think gear is important. If you're in the studio making a record, you know when something sounds bad and you don't want to put it on the record, you change it up, you do something else. You grab a different guitar, you get a different amp.
yeah. I think he's talking about the specifics of thinking that the gear makes you sound good. It's the
Oh, yeah.
reality is knowing how to use the gear
Yeah,
is
well,
the most important thing.
it's all source. Whatever the source, the primary source that's driving the part that's going on the record is the thing that matters the most. It's the drummer, it's the singer, it's all of that shit. Because there's records from like decades and decades and decades and decades ago, and some of them really stand out and they sound pretty ahead of their time. And a lot of that is because the people who are on those records are fucking ahead of their time. And
Yeah.
the songs that they wrote, and maybe it was a little bit of the way they recorded it, and that's true. Like it does matter, but like without the source, you have nothing. So
Exactly.
I mean, I think a quote like that really stands a testament to like a creative person is always going to make something more worthwhile than a non-creative person with a lot of gear.
Exactly. And I think that's the important thing to parse there is like, it's not that gear is irrelevant.
Yeah,
It's that it's the person utilizing the gear that makes it happen, right? Like Nigel could probably make a record on a bunch of the cheapest gear you can buy at Guitar Center, and it would still sound like a Nigel Godrich record. It might not sound the same as these records, but I can guarantee you he could go get a bunch of weird, shitty like Digitech pedals from the 90s and like a bunch of cheap microphones that nobody wants, and he could still make it sound like a Nigel Godrich record because he knows how to get the best out of the gear and actually get the creativity from like, I think one of the things that happens like with creative people is that they immediately upon hearing like, I know I can speak for myself, but I've heard you do the same thing on guitar. You play according to the sound that you're getting. So like if you're set with like a very clean tone that has like very little breakup, you're probably not going to play a bunch of like fast legato stuff because it doesn't apply. Those two things are completely divergent, right? Like
Sure.
it's not a conscious thing. Like you plug into a guitar, like let's say you plug into a jazz box through like a solid state amp, like you immediately are going to start playing in that realm just naturally because that's the way that your ear sort of works. And I think that that's the way Radiohead and Nigel function in the studio. It's like when they get out a Fender Rhodes, they start playing in a way that is functionally creative on the given instrument that they're actually touching, or a piece of gear when they're like diddling knobs, you know?
And yeah, I might think so. And I don't know Radiohead or Nigel Godrich personally. I've never been in the studio with them, so I can't speak from like any kind of experience. However, and just because Nigel Godrich doesn't necessarily have a very specific attraction to certain kinds of gear. And by the way, that quote doesn't necessarily mean shit. He might have just said that, and then in reality, he's like, "Guess what? I got all this dope ass gear." You know what I mean? It's like,
Yeah,
you never really know. However, my assumption is just because Johnny isn't Nigel Godrich isn't super into gear, maybe that doesn't necessarily mean that Johnny Greenwood is not super into gear.
sure. Yeah,
Brian is not super into gear, and you might have them bringing things to the table, and Nigel just goes, "Yeah, do that. It sounds great."
Yeah. I think they're clearly into gear, but it's the way that they're into gear. It's like functional, because I think in the sort of internet social media age, we tend to see a lot of this like people that are into gear but don't make music or anything good or are actually not very creative folks. That's so common now that I think it's easy for that to turn you off from gear entirely. And I think that that's where Nigel was going with that quote. Right? It's not that gear is not important. It's just that like for those people that sit and like touch themselves to some new pedal that's coming out, it's like if you couldn't make something cool before that pedal came out, you're not going to make anything cool now that the pedal's out.
No, well, and it really is a team effort, right? Because gear is inspirational. It is
Totally.
especially when you find the things that really speak to you. Like this telly that I have is the only telly I play, and I love this telly. And anything that I ever need that is a telly-based thing, that's the one I use. That's the one that makes the best stuff come out of me. And if I go to a studio and they have a different telly and I pick it up and we use it, it's not going to be bad. It's not going to make anything worse necessarily. But, you know, we know what we like, and the longer we play, we kind of hopefully accrue all these pieces of gear that mean something to us, that help us facilitate communication. And this is, I actually think, the most important thing. People, I think, tend to forget that music is really just a form of expression, artistic expression. And all this gear is just, they're just the tools.
It facilitates it.
It's paintbrushes, and it's paint, and it's pencils, and it's erasers, and it's canvas, and it's like all that stuff. But if you give Picasso a napkin and a pencil, he's still going to make something on that napkin that's probably way better than any bullshit that I would draw, because I don't draw.
I mean, I look like my printing when I write or drawings look the same as they did when I was 4. Like I am garbage trash heap art guy, and you could give me like $1,000 paintbrush made of pony hairs and I would still end up looking like it would just be a bunch of stick figures like sitting on each other's faces. Like that's what I would draw.
And that's the point. And I think that these two records, if we're gonna kind of like bring the gear talk into like one kind of point, is that I think these records are two of the best sounding records that I've ever heard.
I completely agree.
They're my favorite sounding records. The songs on it, yes, there's great songs on both the records. Would I put like any of my top 10, I think, best written songs on these records? No. Like, is there a I Can't Make You Love Me on either of these records? No. Is there like a I mean, I'm just trying to think like in the scope of what I think are the best songs ever written. I mean, like to me, like Still Crazy After All These Years. It's like an incredible episodic composition. Like these
like
records,
In My Life by the Beatles, or like stuff like that, where it's like but these records are mood records. Yeah, it's not that there are mood records with no songs. These are good songs. And I would say that
they're great songs.
I would say that like All You Need, if we're talking about songwriting, I think Nude and All You Need on In Rainbows are the standouts as far as songwriting goes. What would you say would be your sort of songwriting? And then in a minute we're gonna get into how you found these records. But let's first just talk about this, because we're talking about songwriting. Like, what would you consider, outside of the production, which we clearly love, both of us, we're gonna get into in way more depth, songwriting wise, In Rainbows, what are the songs that you could hear somebody play on a piano and be like, my God, that's still a fantastic song?
Right. And that's, I think, the true test of good songwriting is you have to strip away all of the supportive production and all of those things and still have something. As far as In Rainbows goes, my favorite is House of Cards. And it wasn't always House of Cards. I always thought All I Need, and I agree, I think All I Need and Nude, Weird Fishes is so
That's
bad.
right. I think I said All You Need, but yeah, All I Need. My bad. Yeah.
Yeah. And even, I think those three, for me, House of Cards, All I Need, and
Weird Fishes,
are my favorites. But like when it comes like it's so, and Radiohead's songwriting in particular, I think is like very unique and singular. Like they
Absolutely.
don't, like to this day, if you go on Spotify or whatever thing streaming bullshit is out there that you use, Creep is still the #1 streamed Radiohead song.
Yeah, and it's on, I think, objectively the worst Radiohead album.
Or like High and Dry, or like anything, like which could be anyone from the 90s who had some sadness probably could have come up with something kind of like those songs. And they're great songs. Creep is a great song. It's got all but like structurally it's very digestible. And I think a lot of Radiohead music is really not all that digestible. Like just off the bat, you really have to have. There has to be something in you, like emotionally, that when you hear that band, you go like, "Oh shit!" Like they get.
Yeah,
me.
But wouldn't you say? At least I would say, In Rainbows is probably, other than the Bends, their most digestible album.
Well, I think it is one of their least risky albums. Like, because I think
sound-wise.
I mean, just like it's the most palatable, because all of these, and you have to remember the one thing that's awesome about Radiohead is that every single record that they put out has some major tonal shift.
Yep.
You know? And they still kind of come back to things like Hail to the Thief, which is the one right before In Rainbows, kind of sounds more like OK Computer, but the two in the middle, Amnesiac and Kid A, are like weird electro albums.
And those were recorded back to back. Like those were essentially part of the same
Kind
recording
right
situation.
And
Yeah.
plenty of artists that do that like go through their phases or whatever, and they use all this new gear and it becomes this new sound and whatever whatever you want to call it.
They really, well, I want to go back to when you found this record, because I think let's get back into some of this stuff, but I want to see the sort of inroads with you, because I do think there's some interesting topics that we can talk about, because I don't know if either one of us are super influenced by the bands that Radiohead would say they were super influenced by.
I don't think I am, unless the Beatles is one of them, in which case I would say yes.
I think clearly anybody in England, the Beatles have to be some sort of an influence. But I do think that so let's talk about Creep here for a second. Creep, the reason that Radiohead got signed, and I double checked all this stuff, was because Smells Like Teen Spirit came out. And it was the whole quiet verse, crazy loud, bombastic chorus.
Okay.
Radiohead was making music, and they literally, the record labels, Smells Like Teen Spirit came out. It's the biggest thing in the world by far. Nothing's even close. And they're looking for what bands sort of use this, quiet, hyper dynamic shift, right?
Okay.
And Radiohead was the band, and Creep was the perfect example of that, which is why that song was released as a single. Both of these bands say that there's only one band they got that from. It was the Pixies.
Okay.
They were the Pixies were the band that did quiet verse, loud, crazy chorus. I do like the Pixies now, but by no means are they anywhere near as influential for me as Nirvana and Radiohead are. Would you say the same thing?
Specifically about the Pixies? Yeah. I like Where Is My Mind, right? Which is I think a good example of what you're talking about in a certain way. Although the vocals in the verse are pretty up, but yeah, the Pixies. There was sort of I grew up playing classical music first, and I was very into highly well executed difficult music. So by the time I was listening to Radiohead, I was in high school. And I was still really into very highly well executed music. And to me, the Pixies just sounded kind of a little more trashy or irreverent or whatever you want to call it. And that didn't really resonate with me at the time.
Totally. And it's not as hooky as Nirvana was either.
Yeah, but Radiohead is there's no hooks on In Rainbow. So obviously there's definitely a discrepancy there too. But but I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
And the Pixies, no, the Pixies were not I don't have Pixies posters or never saw, went to concerts of them, but I respect them. I would never say a bad thing about them, mostly because I haven't sat down and listened to all their music to formulate a real opinion. But do you want to talk about how I found out about it In Rainbows?
Yeah. Why don't we talk about In Rainbows? So sort of lead us up. So you're in this sort of classical world, and then you're probably in, I would imagine, some sort of a rock world, but a little bit more articulated rock world of bands that were a little bit, I don't want to use tighter as a compliment, because that's not always a compliment. And clearly where we've sort of gotten in our understanding of music, that's not the most important thing at all.
Yeah, I would call it athleticism. I would say bands that flexed their performance athleticism appealed to me.
What was it, Dream Theater or what?
Yeah, I mean anything proggy. I went through a big fusion phase. In
high school.
Yeah. So here for me, music really kind of my musical taste really would fall into two different categories. One of them was the athletic category, which I would also put artistically speaking would be the equivalent of an action movie. So
sure.
As somebody who is a big movie person, and I really respect good acting and really serious dramatic roles or whatever. But sometimes I just want to put on Mad Max and drink a beer and watch Mad Max. And
sure.
something about all the explosions, and it's very athletic. It's the same thing that makes people like sports. It's the same emotion and feeling that makes people
And it's
like.
immediately gratifying. It's
It's
also
very
the immediate gratification. It's like
right,
candy.
and it's exciting.
Yeah.
And so bands like Metallica and Pantera and like and it's stuff that I heard that or Stevie Ray Vaughan even, which is like not as like precise, but like there's a lot of like chutzpah there. There's like a
Yeah.
lot.
Not steamy Rayvon.
Amy Ray Vaughan. That came later. That's post In Rainbows, pre In Rainbows. Um, but so that's one end of things. Is all and jazz I think falls into that category a lot of the times too, because you hear these people
Sure.
play incredibly improvised burner solos and thinking like, how the fuck do these people do that? But the other half of it is like the emotional side, and that to me is where I started to really resonate with stuff that wasn't catering to that sort of that athletic emotion of like executing something that's incredibly difficult and has character and all of those things.
Yeah.
Like that's where Radiohead came in, because like I mean like most teenage kids, I was like had my sadness and like was
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
you know do something constructive with those emotions, which I had no tools for. But Radiohead and like Bjork and all of these sort of like moody, sad artists struck a
Primarily 90s artists.
yeah, well, and it was
Sounds like.
I mean, and it was at the end of that, it was the end of the 90s. I had an older brother. I have an older brother who's 8 years older than me. So growing up, I like the 90s really defined like most of my popular music things, like Smashing Pumpkins, like all of these bands. And the Pumpkins also like they have that athleticism because Billy can really shred and Jimmy, the drummer, can really play.
Yeah.
But like they write these really sad songs like that really resonated with like my loneliness. And actually,
Well,
when I was thinking about this podcast, this is something I just want to bring up because I feel like eventually we can like really focus on this. But the sound of these two records, and really in relevance to my own personal life, is that amazing combination of comfortability or familiarity and depression. And it's that weird melding that humanity has seemed to really kind of glob onto, is comfortable sadness. And like
yeah.
and I think that Nigel Godrich is a fucking genius when it comes to that emotion and that sound. Because when I listen to that, like let's stick with In Rainbows. When I listen to House of Cards or or Weird Fishes or All I Need or any of the songs on that record, really, with a few exceptions, it's like this blanket of it's sad, and you get these kind of like dreary, melancholy, emotional responses out of it, but tonally is very warm. And I think the
Yeah.
same with the Beck record. Tonally and sonically it's not very angular sounding. It doesn't put up a lot of opposition. To me, it's like I feel like if I mean I've never done heroin, but if heroin sounded like an album, it would be this. It's that
Sure.
sort of sinking depression of like I don't know, giving up, if you want to say. And even Tom York said, I read in an interview, that the sound they were going for on In Rainbows was like that weird feeling you get when you're stuck in traffic and you're like, am I doing the right thing with my life? You know,
Sure.
so pacified by the immovability of it all that you
And
sort of just sit in it.
And the lyrics on this record, though, I will say, are not as depressive as something like OK Computer. Like, there's not the, like, the world is fucking doomed. Everything is terrible. Like, that era, sort of like late 90s Radiohead, I think where Tom was at in his life, although he always is going to have this sort of depressive artist tendency of writing sad boy music. I think that clearly he's like, he went to film school, like that's a sort of overly publicized thing, but like he went to film school, he loves mood. But I do think lyrically this record is actually much less depressing than the mid to late 90s version of Radiohead.
Yeah, and I maybe depressing is the wrong word. What I really think what it comes down to is the the uncontrollable parts of your life where we all grow up uh, building these fantasies about that are informed by media and our family and our communities or whatever, about like how life is going to go. And as you get older, you kind of realize like these things that you dream of, some of them happen, some of them don't, but no matter what, you kind of get left with this well, now what kind of feeling. Like,
Totally.
even when the good things happen, it's like I love my gig with Lukas, but sometimes I'm stuck on an airplane and I'm thinking like, do I really want to be here? And it's like, because in the moment you can only see the very direct thing that's in front of you. And I think
Yeah.
that's what he's really talking about. It's like, as you know, humanity just across the board is always chasing something better or something new or something different. And like, even when you get that something new and something different, it's so fleeting that inevitably you have to come to terms with the fact that like life in general is just out of your control. And probably, depending on who you are and how much work you put into your attitude, is always going to be a little bit not what you expected, in
Yeah.
maybe a way that lets you down. But because life in general is still good, you get that weird mix of like comfortability and stability and acceptance because you're older or you've been working and it's working and all that kind of shit. But at the end, it's like the inescapability of like letdownedness or like
Yeah.
or unfulfillment, I think is what it is. But humanity thrives on that shit. People love their depression. They will hang on to it forever. One of the hardest things in the world to do is to let go of something bad.
Yeah.
So
And is there a band that does a better job in the popular sphere? Because there's a lot of bands who harp on this a lot, and there's a whole lot of like sort of emo and shoegaze music. But as far as bands that have captured the public consciousness internationally, I don't think that there's a band that does it better than Radiohead. For
no.
other emotions, like you could say Metallica's the version of anger, right? For like instead of sadness and teenage angst and lack of sort of fulfillment in the true deep sense, I think that Metallica is maybe the other side of it, where it's like, if you want to talk about how anger translates internationally in music and sort of like testosterone fueled man thoughts, Metallica is sort of like the other side of the coin, where it's like not all of those heavy bands were able to capture international consciousness. It's like bands like Nirvana and Radiohead and Metallica that are able to capture an emotion. They all write great songs, but ultimately their music has an inescapable mood. I don't think that there's any bands in the last like 30 or 40 years who have done it, at least if we're talking about this specific emotion that you just brought up, better than Radiohead.
I mean, in my opinion, probably not. And I think it's important to recognize that those feelings and emotions do not just come from the songwriting. It's about like tonally how you represent that music. And that's the thing about this record that I think is so great. Is like the analogy I came up with just now is like that feeling when you get so upset about something and you cry and it's horrible, and but like there's also a release to it, and there's a moment when you cry through something at the end of it where you've kind of brought this feeling of absolution to the
Yeah,
situation.
and it's a cleansing of the palate almost.
Well, and it's this perfect moment where sadness and happiness kind of like become one. And that's the thing that I think that record and that sound, like this Nigel Godrich sound between these two albums, and maybe specifically the Radiohead one, just because the Beck one is a kind of a different subject matter, but that like indescribable, perfect, comfortable, familiar place in being a human being where sadness and happiness combine is
Yeah,
the
the
thing.
coalescence of those two things is really the sound of Radiohead, and in particular the sound of this record, because some of the earlier ones, like I mentioned, lean probably, although there's a feeling of absolution, it probably leans more towards the sadness. This record seems like it's a perfect encapsulation of, it's an exact middle ground between those two things.
Well, and it's important to recognize the fact that you're not talking about tragedy. This is not like Schindler's List, you know, like
Sure.
seriously, it's not.
Yeah.
You're not talking about something that's like this. This is a type of sadness that's avoidable and just shouldn't be, like genocide or some
Hmm.
horrible thing that's man-made. No, it's like an inherently. Oh, ladies and gentlemen, he's left. I guess it's my show now.
You've
Well,
now. I'm checking. So I've got some new tech gear going on. I want to make sure my phone doesn't die.
oh,
So let me. I'm gonna pause the video really quick, so everybody, you can go get a Cheeto and then come back. And we're back.
I don't know
Okay.
what we're talking about.
I don't remember either. But oh, we were talking about the sound of this record and sort of feeling of absolution. But let's talk on a little bit more musical level, because I think that we've talked on this emotional level that I think people will recognize. But let's talk a little bit more on the musical level of like when you first heard this record. So you heard this record probably in high school, right? You probably would have been towards the end of high school.
How old do you think I am?
Well, I don't know. This came out in
Yeah,
2007.
2007. Yeah, I was in college. I was in
Okay, sorry. I was in high school.
You were in high school. I know this face can really,
Sure.
Yeah, I was at the end of college, and I was still very much in my jazz brain at the time because I was doing a jazz degree. The record came out, and I remember there was a big buzz about it because it was "Pay What You Want," and
Yeah.
that was one of the first times that's ever happened, which is a very I remember thinking like, what are they doing? Like, don't like this is kind of crazy, and like I didn't really know what to think about it, but I just knew that was like kind of a new thing, and
Yeah. Some people had done it, but on a small level with like independent release. Nobody who's like arguably one of the 3 or 4 biggest bands in the world ever did anything like that. Like that's something you would do at like a local DIY punk show where they're like, "Hey man, like you're all our friends, whatever you want to pay."
Yeah, I mean, not that not that I ever kept track of that kind of thing, but yeah, I mean, like I think that it was a pretty monumental publicity move for them to do that. And I don't even remember I didn't have like this moment where I heard it for the first time and I was like, oh my god, I know what I'm gonna do with the rest of my life. It wasn't like that. I don't even remember the first time I heard it. I just
Really? Do you remember who showed it to you, or where you don't have any sort of memory of?
Adam Tressler, who's a guitar player in LA and a really good friend of mine I went to school with, brought it up. We were like at a bar and he was like, have you heard that new Radiohead record? I was like, no. Oh, it's really good. You should hear it. That's like the only thing I remember.
Wow. Okay. And so when this record came into your world, you're in college, you're working on all this jazz stuff. What Radiohead had you heard up until then? Had you heard basically everything? Like,
yeah, this was not the catalyst for my like Radiohead love or whatever. My biggest catalyst for that was in high school when Hail to the Thief came out, maybe.
really?
Yeah, that was like the time that I was like, well, because back then, this is like, I mean, if you really want to get into like personal reasons, like end of high school was a very difficult time for me, and I found that my best friend at the time, this guy Paul Vinet, who I was in high school with, showed me he was like very big into Radiohead, and I was like, I fucking hate that Creep song. That song fucking sucks. Like I'm so not.
So that was your only reference for Radiohead, which I think for a lot of people,
that's what they know.
That's yeah.
But and then he gave me OK Computer, and I got into Kid A, and I was like, wow, these guys are really cool, and this is really dope shit. And then I kind of like went into jazz, and then I think I started listening to that Radiohead album, and if there's one thing that album did do for me, it reminded me that like I've had this whole other musical life before jazz. And when you get into jazz, and a lot of people that are into jazz, they get into this thing where like everything else is basically crap. Except for classical, because Coltrane listened to Stravinsky, so obviously it's okay.
Yeah, and it also encapsulates your whole life. Like it really,
it's so hard.
Well, that's what I was going to say. There's a reason for that, and there's a reason that like guys that don't dedicate basically at least 10 years straight of their life doing jazz, they can't make it as a straight up jazz musician because it's so all encompassing. It really does like take over your world when you're working on it. So and you tend to get that sort of like college jazz approach to like everything else sucks, and like all these bands that didn't know how to play are bullshit. And
yeah, well, and there's a lot of toxicity in a lot of different, like, I mean, people that in rock do that too. I mean, it's like people who are fans of this band think everyone who thinks that the other band is cool should fucking jump off a bridge. I mean,
yeah,
it's like sports rivalries. If you're a Red Sox fan and
I think with social media that's happening less and less. Like niches of these things, because actually speaking of Radiohead, Ed O'Brien in a long interview that I watched, he was like, I didn't hear Led Zeppelin until we finished the Bends. He's like, I knew Stairway to Heaven, and that's basically it, because of this exact reason of like, when you were a post-punk, whatever, like you're into REM, Talking Heads, The Cult, the Pixies, the rocker kids are a completely different group of people, and you don't necessarily like each other. And if you do like each other, you might just give that nod in the hallway. but it's not like the dudes who are into the Pixies and into REM are not listening to Led Zeppelin. And there was a real, because it was a cultural thing. Now there's so many niches and everything's very homogenized. I don't think that's happening as much anymore,
Probably.
in the same way that it did maybe when we were kids, and probably even more so when Radiohead were kids, where it was really like you were either like a punk or a metalhead or a classic rocker, and it was like that's all that you did, and that was sort of the end of the road.
Well, yeah, and in jazz school, that's pretty prevalent. But what this record did for me, I think, was brought me back to the realization that, like, there is good music in the world that isn't jazz or classical. And just because something doesn't require years of study to necessarily execute, just because the actual subject matter, like, um, fundamentally in the music is simple, just because there's no sharp nine chords or fucking whatever bullshit is not
Yeah.
in the record, doesn't mean that it's bad. So if there was any kind of revolutionary thing for me because of that record, I would say that it probably contributed to that. And a quick side note to anybody who ever listens to this, if you are somebody who is trying to pursue music and you're getting into jazz and you're getting that feeling that those walls are going up, that like if it's not jazz that it sucks, for God's sakes, break those walls down or become the fucking best jazz musician in the world, please. Because the last thing that the jazz genre needs is a mediocre musician. For God's sakes, if you're gonna do it full on. Be the best fucking jazz musician in the world. And if not, if you just
Expand.
yeah, please be open minded and let other things be cool. Let hip hop be cool. I mean, like the
Well, and speaking of that, I think Radiohead is the perfect band for somebody who's maybe stuck in the cyclical nature of music school or any sort of intense musical schooling, which probably leans towards classical or jazz. I would actually say Radiohead might be the best band to break you out of that, because it's not completely divergent like it would be like it's probably not going to happen where you're listening to Coltrane and Joe Henderson and like even fusion like tribal tech and stuff, and then all of a sudden you're listening to Neil Young, because that's complete, like that is an absolute sea change of thought. But I think Radiohead is a really good band to bring into the fray that, like, hey, you don't have to be virtuosic at your instrument to write music that is completely singularly focused on one thing and is actually pretty interesting musically. Like, there's a reason that so many jazz people like Brad Mehldau and Robert Glasper and folks like that love Radiohead. There's a reason for it, because they're that perfect band where it's like they're writing songs that are musically interesting, but they're not virtuosic musicians, but they're still the compositions are still interesting to people that are on the farthest end of the sort of genius and quasi like autism spectrum and love all these weird odd time signatures in jazz and all this really progressive music. Radiohead's a great sort of way in.
Yeah, I mean, and another thing I think a lot of those people you mentioned, like Brett Meldau and Glasper, and those people appreciate color and they appreciate variety. And Radiohead, even though they're not taking burning solos and they're not improvising over countdown or whatever fucking bullshit people that do,
They should be, though. I mean,
cool
let's be honest.
about, like I remember being one of those people. They do offer uh flavors that you find really when you broaden your palette, like when you've gotten into some of that weird classical music and some of that weird jazz music and you listen to a Radiohead album, you hear some of these colors, like where you get these like intervallic rubs going on between like a lead part and a harmonic part, or like melodically Tom York is singing like very interesting things. And jazz musicians are sad, so
They're very sad. If you're a jazz musician and you hear everything in its right place and it doesn't make you go like, doesn't like perk your ears up, I don't know what would. You know what I mean? Like,
I'm of course I'm like half joking about that, but yeah. In any case, to get back to what we were talking about before, I was in jazz school. I heard the record. It made me realize, okay, what I really like, because I think what happens to a lot of musicians throughout, I mean, and probably for their entire careers or lives in music, things are always changing. And I, for one, have lost and found my identity as a musician like many times. So
sure.
like I go through these phases of like, what do I even like about music? Like, do I even know anymore? Like, I've spent all these years over here, but then I turn on the radio and what's happening is this, and I don't know anything about this. Like, how did I miss this completely? Like, am I completely not contributing to the zeitgeist at all? Like, I just played on a record that was on Billboard, and I haven't even like,
Well,
I don't even know
I
all
think
these
you're
other people
talking
doing it.
I
So,
think you're talking about a phenomena that happens to all musicians, but I think it's exacerbated in sort of session world musicians because you get stuck in these things where like you get obsessed with something that you might not have usually been obsessed with because you know it's potentially beneficial to your direct surroundings of like working in a studio. Like I'm sure you and I have listened to more pop music over the last decade than maybe we would have if we weren't working in that world of being on these records where you
of course,
there's a certain level of you have to upkeep and you have to update your software, right? You have to know what's going on. You don't have to love it all, but you have to at least have an understanding and a continuation of what it is that you like about current music, what it is that you like about music in general. But that music in general and what makes you tick and what got you into music can get lost and can get overtaken and overbearen by your obsession with understanding certain aspects of programming keyboards or certain aspects of like getting guitar sounds for producers who don't want your guitar to sound like a guitar, and like you sort of get obsessed in. I think it's almost like a fight or flight thing. Like you actually go into like the fight mode of like I have to understand this stuff to keep my jobs, really, right? Like
some of it is that, but also just trends change.
yeah,
So like, music evolves, and like people do a singular human, like with some exception, doesn't really evolve at the rate of change that trends do. So like, but outside of that, there are these timeless things that happen in music, and to me, In Rainbows is one of those things. And
yeah,
something that I got out of that was that what do I care about as a musician? And I care about tone. I care about the overall feel of a thing, how many parts come together to make one thing instead of just being the one thing that people notice and have everything else around you just be supportive. Because as a jazz musician, and as like maybe as a singer, or like as somebody who, or like, you know, if you were the guitar player in Def Leppard or whatever, like that was the thing. You were like playing chords, and then like there's these moments in the set where you step forward and you play a solo, and everything else might as well not exist. And every single person in the crowd is looking at you and all this like triple backflips you're pulling off on your instrument. And
yeah.
like, that was something I had pursued for a long time. And in that moment, and listening to that record, and like, and other records too, Sea Change and whatever, made me realize like, what do I even like about music? I've been studying it for
Well,
years. I've been listening to all these records, and what I get out of this specific one is beautiful tones, songs that actually mean something without saying exactly what they mean, which I think Radiohead is great at. Like
yeah.
really creating an artistic avenue at like communicating a feeling or an idea, which I think is really special.
Yeah,
Nothing Radiohead to me is like very on the nose, with maybe the exception of Creep, because they were kind of like getting their shit
they were
together.
still getting, and they weren't working with Nigel.
But
Also, that's the only
yeah,
record they made that they weren't working with Nigel
right.
on.
So in terms of its own personal influence on me, and what I think that even the basic relevance of something like that even is to anybody listening to this, because I mean, you know, like I can go on and on and on about what it means to me, but I do think in general, as somebody who's pursued music professionally and who music means a great deal to, and has experienced a lot of conversations and obstinance from other people about, oh, you like that? That sucks. Like, why would you ever listen to fucking, you know, artist A or whatever? They fucking blow.
Dude,
And
they're
what
yeah.
they
Artist
suck.
A sucks, bro.
They suck. And if it wasn't for artist B, artist A would never be anything. And it's like, you know what? I don't give two shits about that anymore. And part
Yeah,
of
no,
that
who gives a shit, right?
doesn't matter, because like the only thing that matters is that I like what I like, and I'm going to listen to it on my, I'm not forcing anyone else to listen to this, and I'm getting something out of it. And I play music professionally, which means other people rely on me to make their music get to wherever they're trying to get it in some way. And the people that I feel like I end up working with the most, or that I at least work with repeatedly, are people that resonate with those principles about tone and about parts coming together to cumulatively make a whole.
And the
And
cinematic ebb and flow of songs. It's not just like verse, chorus, bridge, blah, blah. It's never like that. Like they have a real understanding of like, there's a true ebb and flow with Radiohead, and not every song is the same dynamic, doesn't have the same dynamic end point. Like some songs go up and down, some songs start low and just continue to rise. Like there's nothing boring dynamically with this record. Like it keeps you occupied. And I highly recommend to anybody listening to this, when you listen to this record, but I think you should do this in general, but with records, especially like this record and anything Nigel Godrich does, please, dear God, listen to these records on headphones. Because if you listen to these records at night with headphones on,
just not on your iPhone. You know what I mean?
Please, yeah, just don't. I mean, through speakers is great, but I think one of the most magical aspects, and quarantine has really brought me back to this, is sitting down on my couch, like laying down with my eyes closed, with my headphones on, and listening to an album with zero distractions, front to back. There's never any moment of I'm bored with any Nigel Godrich record. To go back to Nigel for a second, and these records that we'll get to Sea Change in a minute, they're just never. There's never an end to the sort of little bits of ear candy that keep you interested without catering to, like, they're not pop ear candy. They're like emotional ear candy that happen throughout the song. And they're just, it's always, it seems like they never overproduce this stuff. And I think a lot of people with Nigel and Radiohead's ability to write these grand cinematic pieces, it's very easy to go overboard and overproduce and put too many instruments on a record, too many effects, and just smother it with a bunch of BS. And they never, ever do that.
Yeah, I agree. And something that I want to say about that is, in my experience of making records, every single thing that you do is under a microscope. And it can be buried in the mix. That does happen. But the people I know that are the best at making records consider virtually every single decision that you could make as having impact, which also means that every note, every rhythm you choose, every pickup selection you do, where you mic a thing, all of it makes a difference. And when I was in college, I had professors that would like really harp on me, like, you know, every note you put on the paper should mean something. And then there are people that think that that's bullshit and that you should just, you know, Jackson Pollock your way through things, which also has an effect. And like, that's great too. However, personally, what resonates with me is when you find that perfect part and you do that for every single instrument and you do that for every sound and everything. And it doesn't mean it has to be good. It's not a qualifier of being good. It's a qualifier of being right. And what right is to me is a feeling. And there's a thing that locks into place when you're in the studio and you're doing something and you find that sound and you're like, yeah, that's it. You know, and it happens.
It always adds to, it never keeps the music neutral. It always adds more emotion to the music. And there's perfect examples on this record where it's like literally they programmed a keyboard sound for one note. Literally, it's like a push and they just 2, 3, 4, and they might wait 2 bars before that single note comes in. And that's the whole part. But you realize that, like, just because it's not this intensely written out, absolutely beautiful line that comes out, it's literally a single note. It might be the root note of whatever key they're in. They spent the time to get that sound and where it comes in on a certain beat, everything about it, where they put it in the mix. It doesn't matter that it's a single note and might be the root note of the song. It doesn't. It adds to the music, and that ability to realize that sometimes dumb is the perfect thing. Like sometimes just adding a single note, but is the perfect thing to do, is sort of the ultimate musical maturity, I think.
Well, I don't think to necessarily look at playing like something that isn't like, to play something simple doesn't necessarily mean that it's dumb, or to play something that only shows up once doesn't necessarily mean it's dumb. I think that the point, at least that I'm trying to make with all that, is that there's emotion in tone. and there's
Yeah.
emotion in parts.
I meant dumb with quotes around it, like
Right,
dumb, and like caveman. Like when people
right,
say
I understand
dumb or caveman, I think of those as good. Like if I'm a studio musician and somebody says think dumb or think caveman, like that actually gives me a great idea of what to do. Like I actually think those are excellent descriptors of what I should do musically if a producer has a really good idea. A lot of things that we would normally consider almost in quasi insulting are actually great descriptors of achieving tone and emotion.
Yeah, I think you can generalize it by just saying that small things have big impacts on records. When you
Sure.
when you're live, it's a little different because there's fans screaming and there's PAs and all this shit, and you might be half drunk or whatever the fuck is going on. And look, I'm serious. Live, unless you're in a pristine theater and you're watching Keith Jarrett and you hear the piano wire break, it's like most things, a drummer misses a fill, blah blah blah. Shit happens live. It happens to Radiohead live, but in the studio, everything is under a massive amount of control, and it's all under a microscope.
Yeah.
So it's just good to know that like every little decision, and I teach this to my students who are like want to get into recording more. Every little decision you make, it's not about whether you're making it better or worse. Just understand that it does have an impact.
Yeah.
So like,
And even oh, sorry, go ahead.
for a very specific example with this record, I'll state just something that I love that I learned from this record. The song All I Need. All I Need, the bass line is done on piano and Rhodes. It's like three different things are playing the bass line because the bass line of that song kind of is the song. And then there's like chords coming to the end, whatever. But piano playing the bass line. There's this thing about piano playing bass. And
that happened on Motown records. It's not like they invented the idea, but they knew exactly when it would be emotionally resonant.
Yeah, it's just
right.
Texturally, if you took the piano out of that bass line, I for one would miss it. There's something about that thing that's really awesome, and they're great at that. There's a song on another record that they did called How to Disappear Completely.
I love that song so much.
And it starts with some major chord, and there's a note in the background of the track resonating that's like, I don't know if it's the sharp 5 or the sharp 4, but it's some aggressively dissonant note to the chord, but it's very soft and it's very high up in the register, so you don't really hear it as much as it just creates this sense of feeling like unnerved.
And I think one of the key things to a part being, like I said, I've used it a bunch of times, emotionally resonant or tonally resonant. If you took that away, people wouldn't know what went away, but they would notice that it affected them. And they're like, where is that thing? What is it? It's missing something. I don't have any. To a non-musician, they would have literally no idea what happened. But emotionally, it would have an impact, and probably a detrimental impact to take that away.
I would say so. Well, and whatever. Maybe it would. But the point is, to me, this Radiohead record, and maybe it's Nigel, and maybe it's Johnny Greenwood, who I think is also a genius. I don't know who's making all these decisions. Probably all of them. But
I think there's a lot of smart people involved.
The thing I respect about the record, and I love about the record, and I love about that band so much, is that apparently, to me, not having known them personally, they respect and understand and implement the fact that the tiniest decision make massive changes on when you're making a record. They can. If you're Death Grips and you're making some trashed out album, like maybe the fact that you're singing through a broken computer microphone and it sounds like, unproduced basically, is the thing you want to do. And I know that's antithetical to like some pristinely recorded Radiohead album, but it's kind of the same principle. This you're making is influencing emotionally, tonally, and emotionally what the listener is going to get out of your music.
Yeah, I was gonna make that point about Steve Albini, the producer. That's sort of an interesting, almost, it sounds like a paradox, but it's really not. That to not give a shit in certain instances is also a choice.
It's giving a shit, almost, yeah.
It is giving a shit, and I think like Steve Albini is a perfect example of like, yeah, you can listen to his records and listen to like the first the Surfer Rosa, the Pixie records, or In Utero by Nirvana, and be like, this just sounds like a fucking garagey, like this sounds like a kid recorded this. That is all on purpose. Everything that he does is on purpose, and it's not the same level of meticulousness that Radiohead's using, but that choice to not worry about when they're moving a pickup selector is as much of a choice as worrying about it. So there's an interesting paradox there, and it can be a little confusing, but I think the more people investigate this stuff, listen on headphones and listen for all of these little bits, because these records can keep you occupied, especially during quarantine, for a long time. One more thing before we wrap up the Radiohead portion. You've kind of mentioned it and like when it came into your life and why this was the Radiohead record that you picked. But do you want to give us any other background on why In Rainbows took the cake? Because I do think Radiohead, unlike many, even huge bands that we all know and love, their track record is unbelievably consistent. There's, other than Pablo Honey, their first record, which you could say has a couple good songs on it. It's a functional record. I would not consider it a classic by any means. Every single record they've put out since that record, starting with the Bends in '95 up until A Moon-Shaped Pool, every record has been a stunner. And I think you could make arguments about which records are better, and I definitely have my favorites within that canon, but I don't think any other band in modern history is as consistent as Radiohead. You look at certain bands like Coldplay, where it's like people, especially musicians, love their early records, and then as soon as they start going super pop, everybody's like, I'm out, especially musicians, like non-radio, just radio listeners. Radiohead is unbelievably consistent, so it is actually really difficult to choose one record from them, because obviously I can tell you and I both love basically their whole canon. Other than when it came into your life, what would you say was the other reason, and what was your second run? What was your runner-up to this record?
All right, I'll answer that in reverse. I would say what's my second favorite Radiohead record?
Sure, and maybe say not dependent on where it came into your life. As far as if you were just listening for the first time now, and you were like, what is the best record as far as just all of it, not necessarily in relation to Jon Sosin's life, but if you were just listening and grading, like, what is the best record? What do you think that would be?
I think for Radiohead, that's really hard because they all sound so different. So you're really doing an apples to orange kind of thing with this.
Sure.
But for me personally, if I was going to recommend Radiohead to somebody who had never heard them before, I would tell them to listen to OK Computer.
I think that's the undeniably the choice that I think a lot of people would make, and it sort of encapsulates their initial burgeoning of creative energy, right?
I think OK Computer is the first time that band very deliberately produced a product where not only was the songwriting really kind of like being pushed, but production-wise, it was almost like what OK Computer sounds like what they were trying to do on the Bends, but they finally figured it out.
I completely agree.
That's an early album of theirs, so like they're hitting that perfect apex of like we're trying. Okay, this thing that we just did, this is like we're really proud of this. It's taken us years to get here, and the songs are there, the production is there, the flow of the album
the youthful exuberance is there, and that's something that you can't recapture later.
It's the equivalent of like, to me, it's like when someone comes out with like their first album and everyone goes like okay, Billie Eilish. Billie Eilish had an amazing year last year in 2019. And it's not her first album. Like, she has these other records, but there's something about that record that was like, we've had this idea about what our sound is for years. And we've had these other EPs and whatever, but finally we're ready to like show like, this is what Billie Eilish is supposed to sound like. And of course, like Ocean Eyes, like her other songs that are from before that are popular and they're good. But there's something about that record that's like, we finally figured it out. And to me, OK Computer is Radiohead going, we finally figured it out.
Yeah. The Bends is it's funny because it's like Pablo Honey is sort of them just getting their foot in the door. The Bends is obviously the first record they worked with Nigel Godrich on. and it was like the songwriting was getting slightly more experimental, and they were finding that the ability to use technology to benefit the recordings. But I think you're right. OK Computer was like, it sort of perfectly encapsulated everything that could be great about seeing a band on the rise.
Well, and my evidence for that is that Kid A, which immediately follows it, is a complete departure. And the Bends, to me, and Pablo Honey, I can hear those records in OK Computer. So to me, it's like they're building up into this thing, and then they figured it out, and they knew they figured it out because they didn't try to improve upon OK Computer after they made it. They said, okay, we did that sound. It's taken us all these years. We're going to do something else. Because if we try to beat this, we are going to lose. We have to do something else. So I would say OK Computer. Now, in terms of In Rainbows, the question was, what is it about In Rainbows that makes me pick it as number one, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I would say every other Radiohead album has songs on it that I appreciate and I like, but I always skip. And this record was one of the, and now that I've it's been in my life for 13, 15 years, whatever the fuck, however old it is. Now, yeah, I listen to my favorites and I move on. But at the time, I used to listen to that record all the way through on repeat all the time. And it gave me this very fulfilling sense of completion to listen to the whole thing. If that album was a meal at a restaurant, I would have left that restaurant completely full,
satiated. Yeah.
Every palate, like area of my palate, fulfilled. You know, sweet, salty, savory, whatever, all that shit is.
It's like Dark Side of the Moon. You listen to that front to back, and you're just like, I got everything. It's all there.
There's nothing missing from that record for me.
Yeah.
And tonally, also, there's a pristine, and again, and like I want to play on that idea of happiness and sadness becoming one. There is this incredible fidelity to In Rainbows, recording wise. The sounds of the guitars, and really everything. You know, it's, I can't imagine what I would like in 50 years when you listen to that record. You'd be like, shit, that fucking sounds good.
And there's nothing we can do in 50 years to make this a better record.
I don't think when I listen to OK Computer, I hear the 90s, and I'm like, I can hear the 90s, like I can hear it. It's like the whatever they were using to record that record, how they tuned the drums, how they mic'd the amps, whatever, how it was mixed, I don't know, whatever. It sounds like the 90s. When I listen to In Rainbows, it doesn't make me feel like, oh, this is like very obviously 2007. And maybe it will in 20 years, maybe, I don't know. But like,
I think I agree with you though. I think that is what puts it over the edge as far as something I would recommend to somebody, especially now in 2020, if they'd never heard Radiohead. I would absolutely say, I'd say you should check out OK Computer for the fact that it was the band's initial reckoning with how brilliant they were. But In Rainbows is absolutely the first place people should start for that exact reason. I think the sounds of this record will never be dated.
And the subject matter of the album is very relatable if you dig deep enough in yourself. I think every single person has this sort of like comfortable depression in them. You know, it's like, think about it. Everybody you know, they can't wait to bitch to you about something. They can't. It's so easy.
Everybody sucks, right?
It's so easy. It's so easy to focus on the negative, and it's a very human condition to be that way. And it takes a lot of work to not be that way. And I think the thing about In Rainbows that I really love, and in particular, if you want to talk about just songwriting, like All I Need and House of Cards, and I'll do House of Cards because I kind of know it better. But to me, House of Cards is about swingers. It's about couples that swing. And the song starts with, I don't want to be your friend. I just want to be your lover, which is such a fucking good lyric. And to me,
yeah.
And the second verse has something to do with like, the infrastructure will collapse from voltage spikes. Throw your keys in the bowl and kiss your husband goodnight. And that, from what I know, in the 70s, people had these swinger parties, and everyone would put their keys in a bowl, and you would go home with someone else. You know, like, and that was like that was like a thing of swinger parties. I saw it on an episode of the '70s Show. Don't judge me for it.
Yeah, you've never done that, and you've
I'm
never
pretty
thought
sure,
about doing it.
yeah, I'm pretty sure that show is entirely factually accurate too. So
Oh,
anyway,
yeah, yeah.
my point is though, I don't want to be your friend, which sounds bad. I just want to be your lover. That entails an entire other range of emotions that are very similar to having a bond with a person, but without the emotionality of it. And that to me is like, I remember, you know, maturing through relationships and feeling like, wow, there's this duplicity when you involve physical attraction with emotional attraction. And here you have right off the bat this song that's caked in reverb and it feels like this warm blanket. And the first thing you hear is, I don't want to be your friend. And it's so conflicting. The message of it is this weird sadness with happiness to me. And that is like one of the most, there's got to be like some word in German that's like kind of Skrudelaffen that means like,
Kind and Skrudelaffen, I think, is
yeah,
definitely what it is. Yeah, yeah.
The
All you German
indescribable,
listeners, get at me. Let us know what sort of German vocabulary you've developed out there.
well, what's the word? Is it Schadenfreude? It's laughing at someone else's discomfort. There's a word.
Yeah, yeah, Schadenfreude.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
like, there's got to be a word. It's the inescapable description, or the indescribable description of the feeling of happiness, and it's bittersweet. Happiness and sadness, like working together to as a human emotion. And
Yeah.
I like that is so real to everyone, and it's so hard to describe. And Radiohead put it in a fucking record.
It wrapped it in a bow. I mean, I think the fact that Tom York as an individual is so great at doing that, but additionally having Nigel Godrich in the room, who's also a genius at that. And then in addition to that, somebody like Johnny Greenwood, who has this whole other career working on these unbelievable, like one of my favorite movies of all time, There Will Be Blood, doing the soundtracks. And I think what happened is this record is an extremely mature group of people that are absolute experts at bittersweet, being in a room together and making the record of a lifetime. I think that's what In Rainbows is.
And let's call it there. That's probably, we couldn't say it better than that, right?
I think that really sort of, once again, puts a bow on the Radiohead discussion. But now we're going to move on to Sea Change. And once again, the through line here is Nigel Godrich and the fact that both you and I clearly have an extreme admiration and just being in awe of Nigel's understanding of tonality and mood. Because Sea Change, once again, let's go back to this. Now, Beck is somebody who's known as an extremely, Jeff Beck, who wrote Sea Change. He really changed a lot since Blow by Blow. I think this is a real sort of left turn for him.
I'm surprised he didn't get Vinny on the session. I could have supported
But seriously, so Beck is known as a guy that is absolutely prolific, right? He writes songs like they're nobody's business. He just comes up with them constantly. Sea Change, I think, is a great example, and he's a great example of an artist that I would never put in this group of, like, if I were teaching a songwriting class at a music college and we were talking about Still Crazy After All These Years and In My Life and Blackbird and, these songs that sort of changed, or God Only Knows, these songs that are really looked at as absolute masterpieces of songwriting. You can play them on piano and everything is there. That's not what Beck is. And it's not a knock on Beck. He writes great songs, but what Beck is really about is establishing a very interesting mood that incorporates numerous genres into one. And he has such a wide and vast array of influences that he can jump between genres like I don't think there's another artist in modern history other than maybe somebody like Miles Davis. And even you can make Miles was sort of inventing these genres, so it is different, but I don't know if there's anybody as diverse as Beck with the records that he's put out. Unless I'm blanking on somebody else, I think he's the most diverse artist. It doesn't make him the best, but when you look at Midnight Vultures to Sea Change to Mellow Gold and One Foot in the Grave, and then Colors. It's like I don't know anybody that genre jumps as drastically and successfully as Beck.
Maybe besides Radiohead.
I don't even think I don't even think you could say. I think Radiohead always sounds like Radiohead with a change in what instrumentation they're using. I think Beck literally is genre jumping in a way that I don't even think is. It's such a vast. If you listen to Sea Change at Midnight Vultures, if you listen to it without the lyrics, you'd be like, "There's no fucking way that this is the same artist."
I mean, yeah, I get what you're saying. I mean, I think that's true.
I mean, rapping and then playing like literally Mississippi John Hurt blues songs, and then playing Sea Change, which is a record I think is heavily influenced by Nick Drake and probably Blood in the Tracks, Bob Dylan, and very specifically that Serge Gainsbourg record, History des Melody Nelson,
Yeah.
which I think the strings are heavily influenced on here, that his dad wrote, actually. I just don't think there's anybody that genre jumps that drastically and does it successfully, literally going from a Nick Drake record to rapping about picking a girl up in his Mazda and like taking her out to dinner. Like it's just awesome. I love it so much.
Case in point, Beck is a badass.
He's so badass.
He's a badass. That's very true. I still think, and there's a Sea Change to me is still my favorite. It resonates with me very deeply. I think that the similarities between In Rainbows and Sea Change are kind of are anchored in that same thing of happiness and sadness being displayed at the same time, which to me is like a something I am very close to, and happened to be produced by the same guy, Nigel, did both records. And
5 years apart from each other, so there's not that much time distance either.
Yeah, not that much. And there's actually another Beck record called Morning Phase, which is the follow-up to Sea Change, which I actually think sounds, I mean, it's 10 years of recording technology later, and the sound quality of Morning Phase I actually think is more pristine. But because Sea Change is the first, and it has Golden Age on it, which is like my fucking song, that song
Yeah.
is just the it for me. And like Maybe I'm a Lost Cause. I don't know if I'm getting all those titles right, but anyway, it doesn't matter.
Lost Cause. Yeah.
But that's why I picked that one because, and I feel like without Sea Change, there wouldn't have been a Morning Phase anyway.
I agree. And I actually think there's more daylight between those two records than people think. I think in the oeuvre, sweet ass word, of Beck,
Yeah.
oeuvre, I think people have to relate Sea Change and Morning Phase as being, they have to relate them because they are absolutely the closest to each other of anything else that he's done. But I went and listened to them back to back, and I think they're actually very different records. The tonality and sounds on it are actually, because Nigel didn't produce Morning Phase, Beck did.
I think Beck actually said, or like maybe I read it in a Rolling Stone article, that like this Morning Phase is like being heralded as the follow-up to Sea Change. So people were already making that connection between them.
Totally. But I'm saying under a microscope, when you actually like outside of listening to these dingbat music writers that know nothing about music, they're actually not all that similar. Like there's several songs that are on Morning Phase that there's no way they would have worked. Even with the production of Nigel, they just wouldn't have fit Sea Change. Sea Change is an incredibly specific mood that there is variance in the record, but it's a very, very specific mood. It's not just like, oh, it's down tempo, happy, sad music. Like there's something very specific about it. Like something like My Heart Is a Drum, I don't think would have worked on Sea Change.
And again, like, I mean, I'm just working off of what I know about the record, which is not a ton. I didn't like go on and read a book about it, but what I understand is Sea Change is written about a breakup.
Mm-hmm.
So when you have a singular sort of monumental life event that you create a piece of art around, there's already an inherent cohesion that you're working with because everything is stemming from an event, at least most of it. And I don't know if Morning Phase is constructed in the same way. I don't know if he like had a, his dog died or something happened.
Sure. Yeah.
I don't know. You know what I mean? Like, so I think just because of that, and they're two different records. You know what I mean? It's like I don't want to compare them more than the fact that I was just told and through my own experiences that like they're
Well, I
related.
think it's a good. I think it's an interesting comparison because I think it does highlight the difference when Nigel's not there, and what Beck sort of gets up to when he's in a similar mood but doesn't have Nigel there, and where they diverge. I think it's actually, it really showcases what Nigel brought to the table and what Beck sort of filled in his absence with Morning Phase. I think actually that comparison is, it's very important to understanding what Sea Change is, in a certain sense, that like it is this amazing collaboration between two guys that also was initiated by a monumental life event, like breaking up with somebody. I think it was a relationship he'd been in for like 9 or 10 years.
Yeah, a
So
long time.
significant change in his life, and I think it's clear in the music.
Sure, and the fact that Sea Change was made first, I mean, like, you can't tell me that Beck didn't take everything that he learned from making that album and just digested it, and then when he went in to make another one, was like, well, I did spend, like, fucking months with
Yeah,
Nigel Godrich. Like, I do kind of know how to do some of this now. So, like, I'm sure some of the techniques carried over and some of the
totally.
tonal choices and shit. I mean, like, dude, it's not like Beck's born yesterday. I mean, the fucking dude's been making records for decades. So,
Yeah, I really think for me, Sea Change might be my favorite sounding record of all time.
yeah, well, and again, like I think, like I want to kind of keep on bringing it back to this feeling of being happy and sad, and that record is, what am I, subject matter wise with the breakup and everything. And if you read the lyrics, but without the music, it's like, geez, dude, just rip your heart out of your chest, But
Yeah.
the music instrumentally, at least for a lot of the songs, in my opinion, are like very light. It sounds light. It doesn't sound like this moody storm cloud. Like maybe there's like this vast expansiveness to the fact that like there's all these like bell sounds that have a lot of decay in them, and there's a lot of reverb happening, and there's but like tonally,
Well,
like it's a lot of major chords.
well,
This is
that's what I was going to say is, although it is a lot of major chords, there's also a lot of implication of, in the vocals and in the background parts, of sort of major sevens and sharp 11s and all this stuff, which I think leads to this feeling of, you get the happiness of the major chords, but you get the lack of stability of notes like the sharp 11 and the major 7 and the nines, all these extension notes that never sound completely grounded. Like it always sounds like a slight lack of stability and a slight, almost hovering quality to them that never lets you feel completely like, that's what keeps them from sounding like a major song in the sense of being like, just like a happy-go-lucky major, or even a major key song at a tempo like Sea Change, that is a extremely sort of like triad chord tones, and that's all it really is. And it's very like, I think that he leans intentionally on, yeah, I'm doing major chords, but the lyrics are sort of this lack of stability in my life now that I don't have this person. And I think that he lets the melodies of the instruments and the vocal melody really dictate that lack of stability, not the guitar chords. You know what I mean?
Sure. Well, and also, I think it's worth noting the tone of his vocal on that record is like, it's not full of energy. It sounds like some dude who's just been trapped somewhere or is like down deep in a hole and is saying, help me. I mean, like but it's cloaked in this pristinely beautiful background of all these great players like Joey Warnaker and Justin Meldal Johnson, like
James Gadsden on half the drums too.
Captain's on half of it. I
Well,
mean, but like the sound of the record, if you take the singing away and melody away and everything, with some exceptions, because some of the tracks are dark.
yeah,
Like
some of them get really dark. Yeah.
I think it's called Around the Bend, or I have to look it up because I'm not great with all the titles. Because we live in streaming now and everything is just on your phone all the time and you don't actually put the record on.
Yeah.
Hold on one second. I'm just gonna look really quick. Oh, so good. Round the Bend. Round the Bend is so dark.
Yeah.
Grown with the strings and this.
Well, let's talk about the sound of this record, because I think what really encapsulates, I mean, if we're going to put it in, obviously there's a lot of the nuance of emotion and stuff that we can't capture in just talking from sort of a gear and tonal standpoint. But I do think that this is a huge part of the sound of this record. They all tracked live in a room. They only did 2 or 3 takes. And when they did overdubs, they all tracked together on overdubs too. So that increases that liveness, the live feeling, and the feeling that it doesn't sound like it was created in a laboratory. But as far as sound of this record, for the most part, now there's divergence across the record, but it's mainly drums, electric guitar, and bass are absolutely dry. They are recorded close mic'd, and there's almost no room sounds. It's all like just close mic'd, and all of that reverberation and delay and sort of juicy decay sounds are all surrounding this basis of this band. And so it's sometimes the acoustic, it depends on the song, how that's treated. But ultimately, it's like a rhythm section. For the most part, bass and drums, you can say consistently are dry as hell through the whole record. And then all this swirling craziness around them, whether it's these really drenched in reverb strings, drenched in reverb vocals, or like you said, sort of like mallet and
Yeah, there's like bell sounds. I mean, there's a lot of acoustic guitar on the record too.
yeah.
But yeah, it's very yeah, it's very flat, and it's like kind of in your face. It's very present. You know what I mean?
At least the rhythm section is. Everything else is not necessarily super present because it's supposed to be sort of swirling around. Like I really think about it like the eye of the hurricane, right? Like the drums and bass as the rhythm section are right up in your face. Like there's literally they're just, you could tell they're close mic'd. Apparently the bass was literally no DI, and I think it was a single microphone on an Ampeg B15.
Yeah, I believe
And
that.
so it's literally like most of the records, a Guild Starfire bass played with a pick with one microphone into an Ampeg B15. And the drums are basically the drummer's performance with a bunch of mics close mic'd. And that's it. So you get this feeling of like, it's right in your face, the eye of the hurricane, like the band is grooving. And then all of this swirling vocal effects and harmonies and strings are sort of swirling around like, like the chaos of the hurricane, and everything else is sort of right in the center. And it leads to just this unbelievable quality of like, I almost can't describe it. It's so incredible.
Yeah, it's a phenomenal sounding record. I mean, and I do think that there's a sort of there's a purity to making a record in that way, where like you really are capturing source in a very simplistic way, because they are, and I think emotionally speaking, that translates in a form of like really sort of saying like, this is it. You know what I mean? Like, this is a very simple situation. I broke up with a girl. You know what I mean? Like the relationship ended and I'm sad. You know, like it's very simple. It's not really, on a certain level, it's not really that layered. You know what I mean? It is very just like straight into the point and right in front of your face and raw. And I think when you close mic an amp or some drums and you let the player do their thing, there's no hiding. You know,
Yeah.
there's no
And those
layered.
players can function in that environment too because they're so killing. Like when you
This
get
is great.
Joey Waronker and James Gadsden and Smokey Hormel and Justin Meldal Johnson as your sort of band directly surrounding Beck, those guys are all so killing. Like the drums on this record are so pocket that people don't even realize how pocket it is. Does that make sense?
Probably. And I mean, also, like, whoever, I don't know if it's Beck that's playing acoustic, but whoever's playing acoustic on most of this thing is really a big part of how the album feels. Because,
I
like,
think it's mostly Beck. There's some Smokey, but it's Beck. And you can really hear, although it's completely divergent genre-wise, his Mississippi John Hurt finger-picking influence on this record. Because that's his big finger-picking influence, and there's a ton of finger-picking on this album.
yeah, a lot.
And I think, yeah, you're right to include him in that because the acoustic playing is very important. And it's a little bit sloppy, but always pocket. And I think that's the important thing, is that he's not a session guy, but his timing is good. And that's what really matters.
Yeah, well, and the emotionality of being consistent and stable, but then also not exactly precise is sort of
Better a lot of the times.
it's just special. It's just like it's a unique thing. Not everybody can do it. He can do it, and he wrote the music, and the music is about his life. And to me, what makes a great record beyond just having great songs is that whatever the influence is thematically in that piece of art is carried through to everything that's happening. So if the songs are sad or whatever emotion or bittersweet, whatever, like whatever that means artistically, to make drums sound bittersweet, to make a bass sound forlorn, to make an acoustic sound I don't know, broken spirited, like whatever you want to call it, this is still art. And art,
Yeah.
you're supposed to take intangible things and principles and feelings and make them more tangible so they can be digested by the viewer or the listener. And I think that, and I don't, what do I fucking know? You think like Nigel Godrich and Beck sat at a fucking, at a brunch spot in LA and talked about how they were going to make all the instruments have feelings? Like, I don't know. I don't fucking know. But like, to me,
I'm willing to bet a
I hope
large
they
portion
did.
of my life savings that they did not do that.
I hope. I feel like that's like an overheard LA
So
situation.
hey Beck, how do you think we could get emotion out of? You think he calls him Hey Beck?
Hey,
Hey
Beck.
Beck, how do you think we get emotion out of this bass sound?
Yeah,
I don't. That's not how Nigel sounds. He's also British, but like I just imagine the pretentiousness of
yeah, just a little sadder, maybe. I don't know. Like, I
one
love him.
more. I think another mic will make this sadder. Like
Yeah.
because but I think that's a good point. Like they're not talking about it like that.
No, it's just
They're
happening.
not. It's just happening. But I do think the fact that they did, and the reason I know this is true is in doing research for this record, Justin Meldal-Johnson is actually very active, at least has been in the past, on gearsluts.com and talkbass.com. So I actually did some researching and found some forums where like people are just straight up asking him questions about the record, and he answers all of them in depth, like what bass he uses, what microphone he uses, and he was like, we did literally 2 to 3 takes at most. Some of them are single takes, but mostly 2 to 3 takes in a song. And he said like if they went back to do some sort of an overdub, like if there was a percussion overdub, Smokey would go back out and do his guitar overdub at the same time
Right.
they were doing the other overdubs. So like literally they might have done 1 take of overdubs and that's it, and then they brought in the strings
Right.
and that's it. So the liveness of that feel, or of having this super basic approach to making music, of like, we got killer musicians, we know what we want the record to sound like, let's just record. Like everybody knows what to play, and it's being captured in a way by Nigel that is absolutely perfect for his understanding of what the record should sound like. But let's talk for a second, because I think one thing we haven't mentioned, because it's such a big part of the record that it should be almost its own conversation. The strings on this record are, in my opinion, I think my favorite strings on any pop, like non-classical record of all time.
They're excellent. I mean, his pops wrote them all,
His
right?
pops wrote them all, and I can't remember his dad's first name, but his dad, Beck's dad, is a very famous string arranger, and he's worked on a ton of records, and recently has done like Justin Timberlake and all sorts of stuff like this. He's done movies and so many big records, and
Yeah, he's a beast. That guy.
he's a beast. And you could tell he was once again influenced by that Serge Gainsbourg record. But my God, the strings in this record, they really are the primary melody instrument other than the vocals in this record. Would you say that's true? Like if you think about like where the melodies on this record are coming from, it's basically the 2 lead instruments are Beck singing and the strings. They're so prevalent, they're so forward in the mix, and it's not this massive orchestra. You could tell it was a relatively small group playing lines that are either doubled or just a couple harmonies. They're not this massive thing most of the time. And they're just so perfectly placed. I really I can't express enough how perfect and how amazing it is that his dad was able to do this, that it really, I think the strings really make this record. I know that you could say a million different things do, and if anything changed, it wouldn't be the same, but they're extraordinary. Had you heard a pop record before this, that you could say the strings were this well done?
I mean, I guess. Like, I mean, I don't know if I ever qualified it that way. I mean, I do think the strings on Sea Change are like very important, and the guy did an amazing job. I guess like the only other records that come to mind that like utilized a lot of that kind of stuff that really made me think like, wow, like that's like so I don't know, like left of center, or like such a like an amazing contribution on this album. I don't know. I mean, I'd have to like think about that for a while. So maybe not. Maybe that really is like the apex of that. Um, but uh, but yeah, I mean, yeah, they're amazing and they're very emotional, I think, and they really carry a lot of weight, and there's an interesting sort of relationship between the lead vocal and the strings. I know, like in particular for me, the two songs that step out are Paper Tiger
That's my
and
favorite.
and Round the Bend, and the strings on those two tracks are very they take up a lot of space. They play a major role, and that's risky. I mean, like
Very risky.
I
Yeah.
think I think a lot of times, like I mean, okay, like for example, you take a song like I don't know, I Don't Want to Miss a Thing, Aerosmith. Isn't
Yeah.
there an orchestra on that song? Or like Drops of Jupiter by Train? Like
Sure. Yeah.
that's like pop shit that was on the radio that had strings in it. And I feel like a lot of like leading up to putting songs out that have maximal productions like that and still calling it a rock song or still
Yeah.
calling
And
whatever is a very like it's a risky thing because normal people hear violins and cellos and shit and they think, oh, this is like a classical crossover. And it's like, no, it's just using strings. I mean,
yeah.
the same way that like accordion has found its way into making there's accordion, I think, even on Sea Change.
I think you're right. Well, let me offer a devil's advocate approach to, because I think that the way that the strings are utilized on Sea Change is very, very different than the way, because like now I haven't listened to Drops of Jupiter or I Don't Want to Miss Thing in a while, so I hope I'm not getting this wrong. I'm going off of memory. That's a very traditional approach of like an orchestra, like when you see like on TV, they're like, we're going to do it with an orchestra. Now it's different and cool. Like you see that all the time on like award shows where they're like, well, this shit's kind of boring. Let's just put an orchestra here and now it's good. Right?
Well,
Like
I don't bring up those songs in reference to like any kind of
stylistic part of the strings.
competition for Sea Change because like I don't think Drops of Jupiter or Don't Want to Miss is like necessarily like comes from this super deep experience of a breakup or whatever. Like I'm just saying in terms of using strings
Sure.
in a pop or like accessible music context that isn't classical,
Sure.
is something
Yeah.
that like I mean, because like I mean, there's string quartet on Eleanor Rigby, right? Like that's a pretty,
Yeah.
that's a very good example of something where the strings are like, what is Eleanor Rigby without a string quartet? Hearing Eleanor Rigby played on an acoustic guitar or a piano is like weird.
Yeah.
Like it was so iconic and so perfect for those strings to be a part of that song that it's almost as if Eleanor Rigby itself only really exists inside the lexicon of strings for me.
Totally. And that's a slightly different approach. I would say that because it's so melodically about sort of like single lines that are actually equally as important as the vocal, that Eleanor Rigby's sort of leading towards the same type of strings that are on Sea Change. Whereas, and I know this isn't what you were saying, I'm just making this distinction so people can go investigate this. There's a big difference between sort of like an orchestra filling up the background almost in the same way that a keyboard would fill up the background, sort of as a pad that might have a couple varying melodies within the pad. And then something like Eleanor Rigby, where it's like a primary source of melody that is sort of equal to the vocal melody, but more motific, almost like an electric guitar riff. And then you get to the Serge Gainsbourg style strings where it's like, they're not repeating. It's not like a repeating motif. It's literally like weaving in and out throughout the song with the vocal. And I can't think of any other pop thing. The closest I can think of is Eleanor Rigby that has and granted, these Beck songs weren't on the radio, but I can't think of another record where the strings are featured in that way, where they're constantly developing along with and weaving in and out of the vocal, and not just like either a repeating motif or almost like a pad, like a keyboard pad in the background.
Sure. I mean, there's a song on In Rainbows that has strings play a huge role, and it's mostly basically acoustic guitar, vocals, and strings. It's called Bossed Arp, I think.
Yeah, and they're actually similar strings to the Sea Change stuff.
Yeah, but generally speaking, I think like the attitude about the strings on this record is that sometimes you come across an album where people are using instrumentation in a unique or substantial way that lends a lot to the mood of the record, and I think this is one of those records. That's very true. Um, I think Beck's Pops in particular is fairly adept at doing that. So like they got the right guy. Strings. I have always considered strings to be very emotional instruments. Like eh, I think it's been that. I think a lot of people would agree with me. I think strings, they carry emotion in a way that is very, I would say, more so than maybe like bass. Bass is like this kind of thing that like is just supposed to be like, ugh, carry.
Yeah.
You're talking about like Tower of Power or something where like the specifically the bass line, or like Parliament Funkadelic, where
Or
it's
even the Beatles, where like the Paul McCartney's bass lines are an integral melody to the song a lot of
right.
times.
But strings in particular have been used in like ballad situations to like make it more emotional. There's Strings are very emotional, and
Yeah.
it's an emotional record. It's played off of a very specific emotion.
Which is
So
why I was saying about like award shows, strings are almost a shortcut for emotion, right? When people are like,
movie scores. It's one of those things that like, oh yeah, bring in there's a reason why like the sad violin is like a I don't know, like a staple in like in society. It's like, oh my poor whatever,
yeah,
it's there for a reason. So I think for anybody that's trying to kind of like squeeze emotion out of an album, especially one that is particularly like bittersweet or sad, like there's a thing like sad strings. It's like really it is kind of a shortcut. It's a good way of putting it. Like if you know how to write for them.
that's the point. I think a lot of times when people utilize it as a shortcut, it sounds like a shortcut to me. And when I hear Sea Change, I'm like, this was not them going like, we didn't really capture any emotion. How do we get it? Let's call Beck's dad. Like, I think it was like
I
there
don't
was
think
a
it was an A&R decision. I doubt that there was like some A&R
exactly.
that was like, let's go to the LA Phil and see what happens. No, it's not like that. Yeah, it's a very integral part of the record, and compositionally what the strings are doing on the record is pretty, it's fucking awesome.
It's fucking awesome. Well,
Yeah,
let's go back because we didn't, the way we came into this, we didn't actually talk about how did you find Sea Change?
I have no idea.
Do
I
you, or what roughly what time in your life did you listen to it for the first time?
probably in my 20s at some point in time.
So it was
Uh,
like college or after college.
yeah. Um,
Interesting.
yeah.
Okay.
And this is, look, I remember when we talked about doing this, I picked records that to me illustrate like if I as a person was going to be a record, I would want to be one of these two. They resonate with me on a very deep level. And like, without getting into too much of my own personal life, I come from a privileged upbringing and like in a very, affluent area of the world. And I've gotten to like fulfill a lot of dreams of my own and all these things. But I also come from, certain emotional things that were very, very, very difficult for me. And
Yeah.
living in this constant sort of back and forth between high highs of like ultimate happiness and extremely low lows, and trying to reconcile the two into like who I am, what I am now, is like, I think these records do that so well. They take these sad ideas and topics and subject matters and feelings and tones, and they mix them with these kind of uplifting instances of the same things, like of subject matter and tone and quality and like, and the level of execution, even though it's not virtuosic necessarily, is very thorough and professionally done. And as somebody like me who comes from a professional music background and like appreciates that, it's like not only do I get the emotional fulfillment, I also get the, I don't know, physical fulfillment, if you want to call it, of like just like hearing Justin Meldal Johnson fucking rip the shit out of the bass. Like
This was the record that introduced me to his playing actually, and I went and found him as a producer because I loved his bass playing on this record so much. And like, this was the first Beck record I really got into, and then went and listened. Like, I was not a fan of his before. Not that I actively didn't like him, but this was the first Beck record I got into, probably around when I first met you, probably when I was like 19, 20. So a little bit later for me too. And um, I went and searched out obviously all the other Beck records that Justin played on because I love bass. And this bass playing on this record really changed it just changed my life. I was like, this is the exact kind of bass playing I like, where it's virtuosic in its restraint and understanding of developing dynamics. And Justin does such a great job.
Yeah, and his tone is so dope. Like, I mean,
It's
like,
so dope.
and creatively, just compositionally, what he's playing on the bass is so rad. Like, I mean, like,
Paper Tiger.
yeah, it's really great. I mean, like, it doesn't. It's not even really necessarily worth talking about. It's good. Take our word for it. It's good. Like,
Yeah.
just go listen to the record. It's great.
It's fantastic.
I will say, in terms of finding the record, the only memory I have about it is I have done the drive from LA to San Francisco up Highway 1 like many times.
It's like 7 to 9 hours, depending, right? Roughly.
Yeah, but you drive through Big Sur and all those areas on the coast that are just like ridiculously beautiful. And I do remember listening to the Golden Age and driving that road, and just like the feeling of that song is like, you know, and to me the idea of like the Golden Age, that sounds like the prime year of your existence. Like, this is the Golden Age. This is when shit is the best. And he says in the song, he's talking about like driving. He's like, you put the window down, you feel the moonlight on your skin, or whatever, the desert winds, cool your hair, the weight of the world, something. And then the chorus, oh, these days I barely get by. So he's like, all these very tactile and tangible feelings of being on the road by yourself and the wind
and the sheer beauty of nature, but also I'm barely making it through.
I'm barely there. And it's that mix of like happiness and sadness. And when you're like in the middle of actually doing that, and you know, I would say like San Francisco has been like sort of a refuge for me for a while. So usually when I'm driving up there, it's because I'm like, I've had enough of this fucking shit. I'm done. Going to San Francisco, I can't take it anymore.
Which happens in LA a lot. Like, people after a couple months, they're like, I got to get out of here for 3
years.
And we both love LA. We're not, you know, let's be clear. We love LA, but there is sort of a point where you fill your cup and you got to get the fuck out for a little bit.
And it's not just about LA. It's a very human and natural human cycle. You put up with your bullshit and you're working hard and everything is fine, and then whatever, and it stacks up. I just got to fucking be done.
Yeah. There's something very special that seems to dig itself and burrow itself into people's memories about driving in nature with the perfect song or album on.
Yeah, I agree.
When I think about a lot of my favorite albums, it's usually not me listening to it in my apartment when I think about it. A lot of my favorite albums, I think about driving like cross country, like when I went and moved to Alabama when I was like 17, like driving across the country, or like I would drive from San Diego to LA when I was living in San Diego. I would do that drive literally 2 times a week for like 2 or 3 years before I moved up here. And a lot of my memories of like, I can think of these records, or like an Al Green record that just is coming to mind, or like, you know, there's so many records that like, there's something about the visuals of driving where the tactile sensation of like you're not on your phone because you obviously have to be paying attention to driving. And driving is just enough mental space to make you not do other stuff, but it's still enough mental space there for you to take in all of the sensations of a song.
A record, yeah.
Of a record, and you can take in the visual and the record at the same time without sort of overloading your brain, especially when you're driving on the highway, right? Because you're not thinking about traffic signs. You're on like almost autopilot. So your brain is sort of functioning with this like 15% of it's being used, and it doesn't really spike from there. And you have that other 85% for the visual and the auditory sensory, you know, aspects of it. And it really allows it to burrow into your memory. I'm not surprised that you have, especially with a record like this, a memory that distinct.
So I think like that's really where I think like where it really hit me was like I do have those memories. And again, like there is that sort of like comfortable sadness is sort of like to me, and I think this is really important, learning to be okay with being alone. for some people, myself included, is like comfortable sadness, because I'm a very social person, and I put a lot of like effort into seeing my friends and going on the road, and so I can be around people, and I like playing shows and being at shows and all that shit. And when I'm alone, and the older I get, I'm better at this, but especially in my 20s, being alone was like, I all I did was bitch about being single, and how I didn't get to go to this party or whatever. It's like being alone for a lot of people is one of the scariest things ever. So,
Yeah.
but in that moment of driving up the highway and listening to Sea Change, you are alone, but it doesn't, for some reason, feel the same. It's not lonely in the sense that you feel when you're at home in your apartment when you should be on the road, like we all are right now, or that we can't see each other because we all are now. We're all so upset about the fact that we can't live our normal lives, whether we act on it or not. But when the world is operating at normal, and there's nothing keeping you from it, but you're on that journey, you're driving somewhere or whatever, especially a long drive, and you
Yeah.
have that moment where like you sort of just are sitting with your thoughts. And if you're a person like me who gets lonely very easily, it is very easy to sit around and think about how you wish there was someone else there. But I
Yeah.
think part of maturing is a lot, I think, about what makes musicians better at music. As means they're letting go of all these personal things that held them back, and which I think translates creatively. Um, the learning to be alone, to get comfortable with sadness, to let them be two coexisting things in your life, and let it not go like to everything you're doing and be like, fuck
Yeah.
this. I need happiness and instant gratification right now, because that's what I deserve, and that's who I am, and I'm gonna just eat all the sugar I can find and drink all this booze and have all this sex or whatever the fuck you want to do. It's that Sea Change is this perfect artistic representation of like sitting comfortably in your sadness,
Yeah.
as what it sounds like to me. And making those long drives, I feel like there's something cathartic about like all that loneliness. You're sitting there alone, but you're seeing all this beautiful shit, and you're getting somewhere. Actually, you're going somewhere. You're on a mission. There's a purpose there, but within that purpose you can feel all those, that thing pulling you back of like, well, don't you miss your boyfriend, don't you miss your girlfriend, don't you miss this person, don't you miss this thing, or like, don't you want to be at home, don't you want to go home? No, it's like I'm trying to get somewhere and do something and make a change, and in that, and change is uncomfortable. You know what I mean? Like it's something that like you do kind of like brings up memories of sadness or whatever, but somewhere in there is that gratifying feeling of when you're done crying. That weird space between just getting over being upset with something, but not really being excited about something new. It's like that churning phase of turning something over, and you never really truly leave it behind. Like
Yeah.
you absolve it and you get over it, and that's what gives you the comfortability. But that feeling, that forlornness is always going to be in you. It's like an unrequited lover, or like a friend that died, or like something that it shouldn't have been that way, but
Yeah.
life is, it just is that way. That's what life literally is.
Yeah.
And this record to me is that thing. It's
Yeah.
that comfortable sadness. And
Well, and
it's
that, I think that brings it back around to wrapping up both of these records, which is, it seems like this theme emotionally is why these records, there's so many records that you and I talk about all the time. Like, we love so many different records, just like any of the other people I've had on this podcast. Like, you're one of those people that we could play music or talk about music for literally hours and hours and hours on end. But it seems like what really put these two records over the edge for you, as far as being the two records that, because I left it pretty wide open to you, like whatever two records that you want to choose and whatever criteria you want to use for deciding them is up to you. And these two records stood out. I think that emotional impact and all the things you sort of just described, and how it affects your life and how it's a deep part of being human. I think that that's what these two records do. And I really hope that people go and check out these records. I think that if you relate to what Jon is saying, and you relate to the passion with which both of we appreciate these records with, go listen to these records. There is a never ending amount of things you can get from them. You can get all these emotional things. You can be more analytical with them and really establish what it is exactly that they're doing that's toying with your emotions in this certain way. It seems like there's a never ending amount of knowledge, both emotional and intellectual knowledge in Radiohead in Rainbows and Beck Sea Change. And I hope you guys go check it out. And really listen to these records, and maybe can take some of the things that excited us about them and analyze them in the same way that we have. And I want to thank Jon Sosin for being my guest today. Jon, if people wanted to find you on the socials and just anything, whether it's a record you put out recently or played on, or just give people sort of the breakdown of where they can find Mr. Jon Sosin. It will be Sir Jon Sosin at some point in the future, but still right now, just Mr.
Well, I mean, you could go to my OnlyFans. I just my OnlyFans is up and running.
And that's when you play along to these records with your genitalia absolutely out in the open, right? That's all you do.
Yeah, and it's only $5 a month. I have it linked through my Patreon account as well if you want to go there. I don't have
you're double dipping.
At least. No, I mean, I'm on Instagram like every fucking person in the world. It's just my name, Jon Sosin.
Do you want to spell that for people?
JONSOSIN. And then, I don't know. I mean, anything that Lukas Graham has done in the last year and a half or so live, I would be a part of. I know, like, my All Music page has some of my,
And there's a link to your All Music in your OnlyFans. So if people subscribe to that, they'll get a link.
Oh, they better. I paid good money for that shit. But yeah, I mean that, and it's unfortunate that we're in coronavirus land right now. Because if it was not coronavirus, I'd say go to Hotel Cafe for the hootenanny every now and then, and get to know all those great musicians. And I like to think of myself as being included in that universe. And
you absolutely are, Jon. You're one of my favorite musicians, and have been for a long time, and are always somebody. If I have a question or an inquiry about harmony or something, you're always one of the first people on my list to call up and discuss this stuff with. So I really appreciate you being here. Everybody go check out Jon's Instagram page. He's been doing these hilarious pedal shows.
Yeah, it's great. I had
look out, Jimmy Fallon, because Johnny Sauce Boss is coming for your ass.
Yeah, that's right. I want that big NBC money.
When he learns the rules of Flip Cup, he's taking your show over, my friend.
You're fucking done. And I would like a chance to get to play with the Roots as well, if that's kind of out there,
Like the Roots, a great band. Well, thank you everybody for being here. Jon, stay here. We'll wrap up. It's not going to turn off once we end the recording. But thank you to everybody. This has been Album Impact with Joshua Ray Gooch. We'll be back next week, and thank you very much for your time. And hopefully we'll see you again soon. All right.
Later.
Peace.
Take care. Deal it.